Okay, so good evening, everyone, and welcome to the GSD Public Lecture Series. My name is Malkit Shoshan, and I'm the co-director of the Art Design and the Public Domain MDes here at the GSD. And I'm excited to host today's program. Before jumping in, a quick reminder that we have live captioning available tonight. To enable captions, click the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen. I also want to invite you to join us for the upcoming program happening this week, this weekend from Friday, November 5th to Sunday, November 7th. Join us for the conference Landscape of Slavery, Landscape of Freedom, the African Diaspora and the American Built Environment, which includes a keynote lecture by culinary historian Michael Tritty on Friday at 6 p.m. More information about this event is available on the GSD website. And now for tonight's event, Eric Klinenberg is giving the distinguished Carl M. Sapers Ethics in Practice lecture. Carl Sapers taught at the GSD for almost 25 years, and when he retired in 2010, his academic and professional colleagues and many grateful students established the Carl M. Sapers Ethics in Practice Fund to carry on his work and advance the conversation about ethics in architecture at the GSD. Carl's wife, Judith Thompson Sapers, passed away 1 year ago this month. We are grateful to the entire Sapers family, as well as the many friends and of the Saper family who have donated to the fund for their continued support of the GSD. Eric, it is a great pleasure to host you this evening. When I first got your book, Palaces for the People, I couldn't let it go. I read it in one go. And since then, it became an indispensable part of my teaching, and I recommend every spatial designer, architect, and urban planner to read it too. In the book, you mentioned that the future of democratic society rests not simply on shared values, but on shared spaces. The libraries, the childcare centers, and the parks, where crucial connections are formed. You draw on extensive sociological research. You claim that social infrastructure, which you define as the physical spaces that shape our interactions, play an essential but unappreciated role in modern societies, generating inequalities in health, education, crime, climate vulnerability, and social networks. In this lecture, Eric will share with us key findings from his landmark book, Palaces for the People, and will offer a blueprint for rebuilding in this moment of crisis. At the intersection of sociology, community, and the built environment, Palaces for the People addresses some of the most burning challenges society faces today, from the climate crisis to the decline of social life and civil liberties. And it offers a range of simple and tangible actions we can take to reverse this course of decline. Eric Klinenberg is a Helen Gould Shepard Professor of Social Science and the director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. He is the author of Palaces for the People, How Social Infrastructure Can Help Fight Inequality, Polarization, and the Decline of Civic Life, published by Crown in 2018. He's also the author of Going Solo, The Extraordinary Rise and Surprising Appeal of Living Alone, published by Penguin in 2012. His next book, Fighting for Air, The Battle to Control America's Media, published by Metropolitan Books in 2007, and the book Heat Waves, A Social Autopsy of Disaster in Chicago, published by University of Chicago Press in 2002. He's also the editor of Cultural Production in the Digital Age, the co-editor of Antidemocracy in America, published by Columbia University Press in 2019, and the co-author with Aziz Ansari of the New York Times #1 bestseller, Modern Romance, published by Penguin in 2015, His scholarly work has been published in journals, including the American Sociological Review, Theory and Society, and Ethnography, and he has contributed to the New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, the New York Review of Books, and the American Life. He's currently working on a new book titled 2020, A Social Autopsy, to be published by Alfred Knopf. Eric, thank you very much for joining us. The screen is yours.
Terrific. Thank you, Malkit. What a lovely introduction. And it's such an honor to be giving this lecture. I realized as you made that terrific introduction, which was somewhat embarrassing, that this is really a foolish thing that I agreed to do, to come to the Harvard Graduate School of Design and tell you how places matter and that public spaces matter and shared spaces matter. I really don't want to preach to the choir tonight. And so what I want to do is tell you about this argument and do it in such a way that will make sense regardless of where you're from. I know a lot of people here are from the design school, but I think there are others who are social scientists or policymakers or urban planners or just people who are interested in how we remake the world given where we are right now. And so I'm going to try to pitch this talk tonight at the broadest level and try to push you to think slightly differently about things that I know you think about very often. And so I'm going to share my screen with you. And when I do share my screen, I'm going to shrink into this tiny little thing on the side of your computer. And that will feel really weird, in part because what I want to argue tonight is how important it is that we find deeply human gathering places, public spaces that we share and that we can inhabit together. And it is a very weird kind of inhabiting together that we do on this screen, especially now because all I can see are black boxes with white letters on them, and that's not incredibly satisfying. So one of these days, I hope I can actually get back to Cambridge and we can have a conversation in person. I hope you can see this. This is just the introduction to get us going. Malkit, come on your screen and give me a look of terror if it's not working. But if I don't see you, I'm just going to assume that everything works. So this is the cover of this book, Palaces for the People, which, as Malkit said, came out in 2018. And 2018 was a decidedly different moment than 2021. One could probably call it the before time. I'm sure many people here now do call that the before time. In some ways, I did not anticipate what was coming. At the same time, I think that what has happened since 2018 has made the argument in this book even more urgent, even more relevant than I could have imagined. And I know that while the context is different, the opportunities to rebuild have only expanded. And I think the urgency of this rebuilding project has expanded as well. Here is the moment we're in now. It's not 2018. It's 2021. I might have said last week we're on the precipice of passing the most ambitious infrastructure bill in decades and generations. I still think that will probably happen. There's a booming conversation in the United States right now about how to build back better. That's a conversation about infrastructure. And it's actually a conversation that's far more capacious than I could have anticipated. The concept that I use in this book, social infrastructure, which I'll get into in a minute, is on the table, which is a stunning thing for anyone who's been following debates about how to build and where infrastructure goes in that process. So here we are in a robust public debate about how much we will invest in ourselves, what kind of places, what kinds of systems we will invest in. And we're not just in a moment where we're talking about the failure of infrastructure. We're not just dealing with the kind of hopefully later stages of a pandemic. We are also, especially this week, trying to square up to the big emerging crisis, the climate emergency. As I give this lecture tonight, people from around the world, thousands are gathered in Scotland for the COP26 meetings, trying to do diplomatic work to give us a chance to build something different. And the conversation about infrastructure is very much wrapped into the conversation about climate policy and climate planning. We talk about emissions targets. We talk about mitigation and decarbonization and adaptation. And at the heart of all of those conversations are issues about social infrastructure. And so I want you to keep these things in mind as we talk tonight. And as we get going, I want to be clear about the concept. Malkit actually got us running here, but when I use this concept, social infrastructure, I'm referring to something very specific. In Europe, there is a conversation about social infrastructure, which basically refers to the health sector, the education sector, the care sector. Elements of that have entered into the American infrastructure debate as well. But tonight, when I talk about social infrastructure, what I am referring to is specifically this kind of set of physical places that shape how people interact. And the argument I make is that when we invest in social infrastructure, when we build it well, when we design it well, when we maintain it, when we program it, we get all kinds of returns to our collective life. And when we neglect social infrastructure, if we don't see it, we don't have a name for it, if we don't spend money on it, if we don't design it well and think about what it means to design good social infrastructure, we become far more likely to hunker down, to isolate, to get divided, separated. And the urgency of this project for me is that as we begin to make investments and make decisions about rebuilding, if we're thinking about social infrastructure, the range of things that we can do, the range of projects, ideas, policies becomes dramatically different than if we don't. And for those of you who don't know my work and have not seen me speak before or read things I've written, I want you to know that this idea of social infrastructure, it's not faddish for me. It's not something that just kind of emerged in conversations of the last few years around infrastructure. It really comes out of research I did 25 years ago. The first major sociological project that I did was a book about a heat wave in 1995 in Chicago, which is the city I grew up in. And it was this kind of extraordinary event, a heat wave that lasted 2 or 3 days, came announced. The city had plenty of warning, came with all kinds of traditional infrastructure breakdowns. The power went out for days. Water supplies were depleted. People couldn't use elevators. There were massive traffic jams. Hospitals were overwhelmed. It was a kind of classic infrastructure failure. But the thing that was really haunting about the heat wave and that compelled me to write about it is that hundreds of people in the city wound up dying and hundreds died alone. In the city that prides itself as a place of communities, of neighborhoods, strong social ties. This is really a kind of a shocking thing, to the extent of not just the devastation, but also the isolation that was revealed. And I wanted to understand, what had happened and why it had happened. And, like all good urban sociologists, the first thing I did is put together a map. I wanted to understand, who died and where they died in the city. And when I drew this map at first, it looked like the most predictable map you could ever come up with. If you're an urban sociologist, what you expect is that when there's a crisis in a city like Chicago, the most vulnerable people and places will be hit hardest, and that is what happened. So you look at this map, and if you know Chicago, you know that these are the neighborhoods in the historic Black Belt, the south side and the west side of Chicago, places that are segregated, that are poor, that have all kinds of insecurity. Where premature death is a fact of life. And when I first looked at this map, I thought this is no surprise. It's politically important to show a map like this because the fact is, in crisis after crisis, whether it's climate or COVID, it's the same people, the same places that are most affected. We know that they will be in advance. And one of the many shames of our nation now is that we do so little to protect these people in places. But that's a political point, not really a kind of scientifically interesting one. My work really became interesting when I looked a little more closely and noticed something that no one had seen before. And that is that while it was true that in the neighborhoods that were part of this swath of Chicago were most likely to suffer in the heat wave, the story changed a little bit if you started to look at which neighborhoods were the most resilient during the disaster. That's a term we use more these days, resilient. Which neighborhoods had the lowest death rates? And it turned out that I found a set of neighborhoods that were very poor, that were mostly Black, in many cases, literally across the street from places that were in the high death zone, and that for reasons that no one really understood, had the lowest death rates in the city. That demographically, in many cases, they were identical to the places across the street. And I wanted to understand why. So I'm going to show you these images of two neighborhoods that are separated by a single street on the south side of Chicago. The one you're looking at here is called Englewood. And what you'll notice is a lot of green. And you might be tempted to think, oh, green space in cities is healthy and good. And most usually are. But in post-industrial cities, in communities that have been devastated by the demise of the industrial economy, disappearance of factory jobs, has come also the loss of people and institutions, stores, playgrounds, gathering places. This is not a healthy green. This is the green of an empty lot, of abandoned buildings. And there are just dozens of neighborhoods like this around Chicago, hundreds in the United States, places where there's so much abandonment, so much emptiness, that it actually becomes more treacherous for residents, especially the older ones. And people who lived in neighborhoods that look like this, that look like Englewood, were the most likely to die of anyone in Chicago. That was very clear. That pattern was more strong than the pattern of the relationship between race and vulnerability. It was about this kind of layout. And meanwhile, right across the street from Englewood is a neighborhood called Auburn Gresham. And you might be surprised looking at an image of it to know that it too is 90+% Black. It too is deeply poor and has a range of social challenges and problems. But what's stunning about Auburn Gresham and neighborhoods like it is that it did not lose massive amounts of population in the years before the heat wave. It does not have empty lots. It has sidewalks that are intact. It has stoops where people sit. It has shops and grocery stores and community institutions and a kind of booming public life. And what's amazing is that people in this neighborhood, Auburn Gresham, were 10 times more likely to survive the heat wave than people in this neighborhood, Englewood. 10 times more likely. That's an amazing difference in the heat wave. But what I learned when I looked even more closely is that people who lived here in Englewood, their life expectancy was 5 years shorter than the life expectancy of people here in Auburn Gresham, despite the fact that demographically almost identical and they're literally separated by a street. And I came to think of the difference between these two neighborhoods as the difference of social infrastructure. Social infrastructure, this concept, it's what I came up with having looked at how life and death works in places like Chicago. And I realized at this time, social connection, to some extent, it's about civil society. To some extent, it's about social support. It's also often about life and death. And this was really on my mind in March of 2020 when we entered into the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic. Because I remember, as you surely do too, in those early days, when the World Health Organization issued this declaration that the solution to the immediate crisis of COVID-19 was for all of us to be socially distant. You probably remember this concept. It came out of nowhere. Social distancing is what the WHO recommended we all do. And governments around the world picked it up. We were told to be socially distant. And I understood that idea. I got the concept. I knew what they were getting at. But it struck me right away that this was a dangerous idea because, if you think about it, it's not really social distance that keeps people healthy and alive during a pandemic. it's physical distance that really matters, right? It's physical proximity that determines whether someone else gets sick when you sneeze or cough or sing or talk too loudly, right? It's physical distance that matters. In a way, what you need is social closeness to survive. Social distancing tells you, go home, take care of yourself, don't take care of your family. Your neighbors will fend for themselves too. Don't worry about them. This is about individualism and individual, health. And that seemed to me just wrong, right? I mean, I remembered the heat wave in Chicago because what happened there is that people died because they were so distant, physically and socially. People, it's so easy to keep someone alive in a heat wave. It just requires, getting them exposed to cool water or taking them to an air-conditioned place. And so isolation is the big risk. And it occurred to me that in COVID too, we would need closeness, we need solidarity, because if you think about it, if you live in a society where there's enough solidarity to invest in something like labor protection, healthy offices and workspaces, then if you have a job in, say, the fast food industry and you get sick, you don't come to work because you know that if you skip work, you can still get paid for that sick day, or you certainly won't lose your job. But if you live in America, you might not know that. And of course, Americans are more likely to show up at work, even in a restaurant or a fast food joint, when they're sick, and more likely to pass on an infectious disease. Or if you live in a society that says, social closeness, social solidarity matters, you invest in things like education. And if you don't, then when a novel coronavirus hits, your neighbors don't know the difference between COVID-19 and an ordinary flu. And when you say, wear a mask, take this vaccine, they don't want to do that. And that's a failure of solidarity too. So it occurred to me, at this time that messaging was wrong. What we needed was not social distancing. It was physical distance and social solidarity, right? Physical distancing, social solidarity. That was the formula for a healthy society to survive the pandemic. And so, what we got instead was this new iconography, right? We got a different kind of messaging, and we've had it ever since. We live in a world where we talk about relationships and health in terms of distancing, and I think that has to change. The lions put on masks, which I like. We could use masks, but the public sphere got reduced and limited. Instead of shared public spaces, we were home, and then we found bubbles. And as we move forward, there's the possibility that the bubbles will linger, that the distrust of shared space will recur. Interestingly, there is a counter movement at work, and the kind of source of inspiration I have that makes me think that there are possibilities for getting beyond that comes from more bottom-up movements that I have observed in the last couple of years, looking at the debate about how to build, in the context of the pandemic. This is an image of extraordinary new social infrastructure in Jackson Heights, one of the most interesting neighborhoods in the world, a neighborhood in Queens, New York, where there are 167 languages. It is the most congested neighborhood in New York City in terms of the number of people per room in apartment dwellings. It also is a green desert. There are not parks that are easily accessible there. And one of the extraordinary things that happened during the pandemic is there was this push from the grassroots to open up 34th Avenue, a boulevard that courses through the center of Jackson Heights, and it has become one of the most successful open street programs in the country right now. It's 1.3 miles long and is open 12 hours a day and might become permanent. And I think about how public spaces mattered to our health and well-being at the civic level in the summer of 2020, when really the thing that got people out of their homes in places where there was a lot of concern about the pandemic, was observing racist violence and the murder of George Floyd. It was seeing it while at home and recognizing this can't go on. And that was what made people want to go out, and there needed to be a place to go, right? There needed to be some kind of shared space to go, and that's something not to be taken for granted. So the streets and public plazas became social infrastructures that mattered. And now I think about all these things in the context of what happens as we move from the pandemic into climate changed cities. This is also Queens a few weeks ago when Hurricane Ida hit New York, and I know it came through Cambridge and the Boston area as well. And so we need some kind of new paradigm. We need some way of thinking about how we invest in a public realm, a shared world of social infrastructures that will work for the different kinds of challenges we face, for these overlapping crises, the health crisis, the racial justice crisis, the climate emergency. What's unfortunate is that all of those things are happening now and feel dire. And what's fortunate is that here we are in the midst of this debate with real money on the line and real possibilities, for the first time in my life. When I left Chicago, I moved to New York City, and not long after I arrived, my work on social infrastructure was forced to get sharpened. Hurricane Sandy hit New York in 2012. It caused about $60 billion of damage. It did not kill nearly as many people as the heat wave in Chicago, although it got a lot more attention. But it did serve as a kind of wake-up call for people in the United States who were in deep denial about how well equipped their cities and communities were for climate change. And it also sparked a conversation about what it means to build back. This conversation did not begin with Joe Biden's infrastructure plan. It came much earlier. Congress passed a $50 billion relief bill to try to help the region affected by Sandy. President Obama supported an initiative called Rebuild by Design, where teams of architects and landscape architects, engineers or city planners, civic actors from around the world came together to pitch innovative ideas for how you would build new infrastructure that could withstand 21st century challenges. I was the research director for that competition, which meant that I got to work with the teams and help them see the different needs and vulnerabilities and possibilities in different parts of the region that span from southern New Jersey through New York and up into Connecticut. And my job was to try to identify different kinds of problems and different kinds of solutions. And while this was a competition that was about climate risk and health risks and equity, it became very clear that one of the central problems that we had to deal with in place after place was the problem of belonging. That one of the issues that came up and that made crises feel worse was a sense that people had in different parts of the city that they were no longer at home where they lived, that there was a threat of displacement, of being looked down upon, pushed aside, having their humanity disrespected, not acknowledged. It was stunning, although it should not have been. It was stunning how common those sentiments were. And of course, this is before the 2016 election, when all of these issues would really come to rock the American experience and I think destabilize our democratic experiment. To try to work with different teams, I toured them around different neighborhoods and tried to understand how local issues got shaped by the disaster and where things were headed. One of the places we spent a lot of time was the Lower East Side of New York, and I'm guessing many of you have been there and walked around. This is a neighborhood called Seward Park on the Lower East Side. That's right in the heart of things. It's actually the oldest municipal playground in the United States. It's a neighborhood that was once very Jewish, that became thickly populated with Chinese American immigrants. It still has a lot of Chinese Americans. It also is a hotspot for gentrification. It's the kind of place where, if you ever wake up in New York City and think to yourself, where can I get a $13 ice cream cone at a place where the only flavor is salt? You go to Seward Park on the Lower East Side because it has been transformed. It has this kind of, gentrified food scene with the carts and the stores that take credit cards but don't take cash. And when you walk in the streets of the Lower East Side, one thing that becomes immediately clear is how much this disrupts people's sense of belonging and feeling at home, to the extent that it's a problem. The shared public spaces are hard to come by. It's especially true if you don't have money. And I noticed this when I observed some of the local eateries, including the McDonald's and the Dunkin's, places that seem accessible, but when you look closely, you find that there are these signs that say no loitering. And I know from experience, I could walk into a place like this with my middle-aged white skin and a laptop computer and sit for hours before anyone would say anything to me. But I also know from research that throughout New York City and other cities in the United States as well, it has become routine for the security at places like McDonald's to kick out customers even after they have paid for food if they outstay the 30 minutes that they are entitled to stay through their purchase. And so it's a public sphere that requires a purchase. And in some ways, that's not tenable. In the time that I was spending on the Lower East Side, I came to visit this place. It's a branch library, a public library in Seward Park. It happens to be one of the early Carnegie libraries. Andrew Carnegie turned out to be the inspiration for the title of the book. Palaces for the People is an idea that he had. He was an immigrant from Scotland, made a ton of money, and he believed in the library because, as he saw it, it was one of the only institutions that really carried the possibility of lifting people up and taking them to a better place, a palace for the people. When you walk into a Carnegie library, one of the things you notice is that well, first, there's about 2,500 of them around the world and more than 1,700 in the United States. And they often will have a few steps leading up to the entryway. And so they literally lift you up out of this profane world of the everyday and take you into a more sacred space. You can see from the building, I should remember who I'm talking to here, that there are these high ceilings and big windows. The great Carnegie libraries, they dignify the user. So when you walk in, you feel like you're walking into a place, a physical space that dignifies and respects you just through its design. And that was all intentional. So, it's not that I'm a big advocate for Carnegie, the full-fledged human being. This is a man who was a strikebreaker and hired Pinkertons to exact violence on labor unions. He was hardly a faultless man. But it's important to note that this idea of a palace for the people is a somewhat extraordinary thing, and that these issues of kind of belonging really do matter. And it's striking to see the range of people who feel that the library is a social infrastructure, is a shared space that is accessible to them. Every morning, there's this extraordinary scene where people line up waiting to come in before it opens, and it is generally an amazing cross-section of the population. It feels different to be around a library than it does to be around an ice cream shop where it's $12 and no cash, or even to be around a Dunkin' Donuts. And I should note, as we talk about things like health crises, pandemics, or a climate emergency, that libraries in the United States, where we have this kind of amazing set of branch libraries, local places that stand for something in a community, that in crisis after crisis, libraries and their staffs have found ways to stay open, to be of service. One of the things that I have pitched in policy work, including on Rebuild by Design and subsequent projects, I chair the Committee on Civic Participation for New York City's long-term planning group, is the idea of thinking about how you could kind of supercharge the library so that it works better during a crisis, right? So that it's got more reliable power or communications networks. Libraries do a tremendous amount already, but it's interesting to think about what more they could do. And I think also about issues of access, right? Who can come in, and to some extent that's implied in the story of the $12 ice cream cone or the 30-minute time limit. But when we think about what makes a good social infrastructure, conveying a sense that people belong and are welcome is one of those things. Providing access, being accessible is something else. You might have noticed in the design when people were sitting outside the building a few slides ago that there was a ramp and not just stairs. That wasn't always the case. So there's design issues that have to do with who physically can get in. But there's also access in terms of who is invited, who feels wanted. And one of the amazing things in New York City is that there are just enormous numbers of young people who are looking for a place to go. During the day, can't tell you how many interviews I did with people writing this book who work in distressed, impoverished neighborhoods, places where young people often find themselves in trouble, getting involved in activities they don't want to be involved in really, in groups they don't want to be involved in really. And when I would try to understand what was happening, so many of the grown-ups, so many of the teachers, so many of the parents would say, the reason our kids get in trouble is because there's no place for them to go. There's no other place for them to go, and libraries try to be that place. I want to go back to this access and belonging. One of the and I guess I should say, because maybe I rolled over this too quickly, that when I'm going to talk, I've been talking about the library, and one of the reasons that I tend to fixate on the library when I think about social infrastructure is because the library is not just a certain kind of place and institution. It is also a symbol. It is also something that stands for the values of a democratic society, for the best in us. And so it seems to me like when we look closely at a library and how it operates in the everyday life of a city, what it means to have a library as a kind of social infrastructure, we can learn a lot about this idea. And one of the things I think is important about this idea, one of the things I think is important about libraries is that they integrate people in a very particular way. To write Palaces for the People, I spent pretty much every day for a year in branch libraries. And one of the things I came to love, to observe, was young people getting their first library card. And one of the things that was so interesting about getting a library card is, it's not just the one of the first moment for most of these children where there's a card that's given to them that they hold. It's not like a birth certificate that goes into a file cabinet somewhere, or a social security card. It's this card that becomes part of what they carry, that's with them. And what's amazing about this card is, first, it's this kind of recognition, a formal recognition, that you are a person who is recognized, who is acknowledged as a member of a community. You have some kind of standing. It gives you a power, like the power to take a book or a music video, in some places to use a computer. A certain power, but it also comes with a kind of responsibility and teaches a lesson. And one of the amazing things about a library card, when you get it, is you learn that you can use it to take Curious George home with you, but that you need to read Curious George and take care of Curious George, and not fold the pages of Curious George, and not write on the pages of Curious George, and return it in time, because there's another child in your community who wants to read that book. And it matters to you because you now want to read the next Curious George, or Harry Potter, or you name it. And you begin to realize that you will only get access to that thing if that other person in your community who's got those books now returns them as well. And you start to see the way in which, to be part of something bigger than yourself is to participate with civic responsibility. you start to understand this idea of social closeness, of social solidarity, of being in it together, of not just being socially distant, of not having it be just about me and my Curious George and my library card. It's this experience of being part of a shared infrastructure, of being part of a shared institution that teaches you something fundamental about what it is to be in a democratic society. And there are other lessons as well. I learned in the course of doing my research that things I had not known, that libraries are places that do more training for people who want to learn English as a second language than any other institution, that they do more educating for people who want to become US citizens, that they do job training for people who've been incarcerated and have come out of jail or prison, that they help with the job search, that they lend things not just like books, but also like outfits and tablets, and teach people how to re-engage the world. There are, of course, places where you find people working, whether it's schoolwork or day work. It's a free WeWork space, and always have. But also they are places that provide for us a forum for collective life. And there are not a lot of places that do that. It like the books, it starts early. You see early in the morning these story times in public libraries, often multilingual. We're back in Seward Park here, and the story times are in Mandarin and in Spanish and in English, and they're not separate classes for each kid. The stories and the songs are done together, and there is a bridging of worlds that don't often get connected. That I find extraordinary, and it's not just the children; it's also their grown-ups who wind up taking the conversation to other places outside on the playground and often beyond. For teenagers, it's a place where you do homework, where you can have an open and honest conversation with a librarian who will never ask you why you want to know something, will never judge you for your question, who recognizes that part of their job is dignifying you and respecting you. And that is an amazing thing you see about libraries. Not to say that there are not problems in libraries. I saw fights in libraries. I saw really complicated situations. I saw some ugly and dirty things, but I see those things all the time in the United States. And what was amazing to me is that I could count on one hand the number of times in the course of a year when some security needed to be called in to deal with a problem that was so severe that it could not be managed. And that's not true for all kinds of other places. It's useful to know that libraries are a kind of social infrastructure that keep us connected to information, that provide people with not just computers but with Wi-Fi access. Chinatown, the Lower East Side in New York, is a place where less than half of the households have internet access, have broadband access at home, and so the demand on these services is amazing. And I want to circle back to an earlier theme from my work on the heat wave. You'll recall that I told you that people didn't just die in Chicago, they died alone. And I could have been more specific to say that the people who are most at risk of dying in the heat wave were older people, people who are socially isolated, people who lived in segregated Black neighborhoods that were underserved, disregarded by the power brokers of the city. And so I was amazed to see when I spent time in the libraries of Brooklyn, this program called Library Lanes, where once a week, the older patrons of the library system gather together in the kind of shared common room of their branch libraries. They get these actual bowling jerseys, and a librarian hooks up a television set to an Xbox, and they compete in virtual bowling leagues, which are actually quite competitive. And the scenes are pretty extraordinary. And of course, as a social scientist, I couldn't help but think of the kind of classic and massively influential and wonderful book by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone, which you came out of your world at Harvard, a book about the collapse of civil society and community. And it's a very powerful metaphor in this book, Bowling Alone. What a sad image of this lonely roller. And I couldn't help but note the irony that 2 decades after this treatise, here was an attempt to revive local life, to build connections that were life and death connections in neighborhoods throughout Brooklyn through bowling, right? And to physically see this, and what I couldn't help thinking about when I saw the laughter or these smiles, when I looked at the relationships that were coming together in these places, is that each of the people who I observed, laughing and smiling and moving actively, each one of these people would have belonged to a neighborhood and a demographic group that would have been most at risk of dying in the heat wave in Chicago. And it occurred to me that the difference between the neighborhood in Chicago and these neighborhoods in New York was not the demographics, and it was not the culture or the values, the things that we so often think about when we try to understand the nature of isolation or integration. It was really the accessibility of the social infrastructure. It was how welcoming they were, how programmed they were. That's not something natural. That's not something that's just cultural. That's something about how we build, right? It's a choice we make about whether this is our landscape or this is our landscape. It doesn't get a lot of attention, but part of the conversation about rebuilding infrastructure has been in the United States. Should we fund libraries more? Do they need more resources? And with libraries, should we fund parks? Should we fund playgrounds, athletic fields? Where do they stand in this debate about infrastructure spending? Are they luxuries? Are they essential goods? It strikes me that we still, to this day, spend too much time on the kind of old, traditional, hard infrastructure, which is not to say that the bridge and the tunnel and the airport and the road is unimportant. Of course, they're important. Of course, they matter in countless ways. But also, the social infrastructure is significant as well. And when communities, cities have to make decisions during tight economic times, close down the library, reduce the hours of the library, don't invest in the park, let the playground equipment fall apart. Those are choices that have profound implications for people who live around them. I say this also from experience. I grew up in Chicago in the 1970s and 1980s. Chicago, in the decades before I was born, had invested enormous amounts of money, much of it from the federal government, in social infrastructure, in shared places. But by the time I was born, in the 70s and 80s, the city was on the decline. It was in a fiscal crisis, as was New York. And the playground that was not far from my house, the playground was the kind of place you wanted to avoid. The playground had, glass on the ground. The playground had equipment that was falling apart. You were at great risk of hurting yourself if you spent time there. The playground attracted people who weren't friendly to children all the time. And the same was true for the libraries, although they were closed. You could not get into libraries most days. The same was true for the schoolyards. The schools themselves were even worse. The parks were in disrepair. In fact, one reason that people offered at the time of the heat wave for the deaths is that they said, decades before, on hot nights in Chicago, people would sleep in the parks. The parks were welcoming and safe places. And by the time the 90s came around, the parks were places that everyone knew to avoid at night. This is how social infrastructure matters. And it might not matter for the same classes of people all the time in all the same ways, but it has a tremendous influence on our lives, for climate events, for health events, for daily life. The United States is not the only place that's making tough choices about infrastructure these days. Not long ago, I was in England, where they're literally shutting down branch libraries and larger ones as well. They're selling them off to developers in many cases. The ones that are open depend almost entirely on volunteer labor at this point. When we talk about infrastructure, and infrastructure spending, we're talking about what kind of society we want to invest in, what kind of place we want to build. And, as I was finishing up the book, an amazing thing happened. There was an economist who wrote this article in Forbes magazine saying, unless you show me the cost-benefit analysis that cashes out the value of the library, I propose that we shut them down and invest instead in Amazon stores. We would let Amazon stores replace them. It was really a fundamental challenge to the library as an idea. And in some ways of a public good, of social infrastructure as public goods as an idea. And this incredible thing happened, actually. The librarians of the world united and got on Twitter, and they started to write these eloquent testimonies to all the things that happen in libraries, all the activities that they sustain and create, all the ways in which they do deliver to communities on a daily basis. And an amazing thing happened. Within about 24 hours, Forbes actually took that article down. It's like literally took it off the internet. And I felt good about that when it happened. But I also realized that argument about the reason why you wouldn't want to invest in social infrastructure, why you wouldn't want to invest in a thing like a library or a shared space, that was coming from some place in our culture. It was coming from some part of our contemporary value system that I needed to understand further. And as excited as I was about Forbes taking the article down because it was a ridiculous idea, I also recognized that there was more to learn from this experience. And as I wrap up and we get towards the conversation, I wonder whether you could do this little thought experiment with me. And so, if you don't mind, I'm gonna ask you to think about something with me, to go through this experiment. I want you to imagine that there is no such thing as the library. That the library does not exist as a concept. We're here having a conversation about social infrastructure, but the library is not part of it. And I just pitched it to you at the design school as an idea, and you get excited about it. And we decide that we are going to go to the governor of Massachusetts, and we are going to pitch this idea. And what we're going to say is, okay, Governor, we've come up with this idea for a thing that we're calling the library, and this is what we want you to do. We want you to build a public building in every neighborhood of every city in Massachusetts, of every small town in Massachusetts, of every suburb of Massachusetts. And we want you to build this big, glorious library. We want you to build a big, glorious library in downtown Boston, big art installations and theater spaces and, terrific design. And each one of these libraries, we'd like you to fill them up with books and periodicals and computers. We want you to have art spaces and theater spaces, collective spaces. We want you to basically provide the cultural heritage, our shared cultural heritage in every one of these institutions. We would like them to be staffed by public employees who we'll call librarians. They will be public workers. The libraries will be open 6-7 days a week, all day long. The librarians, their main job is to ask people when they come in, how can I help you? And to respect their privacy, not to judge them, to help them answer whatever questions they have. The library will be accessible to all people, regardless of their age or race or ethnicity or social class or political preference. They're even open to people who are not citizens of this country. Everyone's welcome to use this place. And one more thing, everything in these libraries is going to be free. People can take them, borrow them, bring them home for weeks at a time. And to make sure that they give it back, we'll just use the honor system. And that's the idea. And so imagine that the library didn't exist, and we went to pitch that, to Governor Baker. Imagine we went to pitch that idea. I want you to ask yourself before we get into our conversation, how likely is it that the governor supports that plan? that the governor decides to do that. That's a great idea. That's a great way for us to spend our public money. Now, I don't know exactly what you're thinking. I can't even see you. I still am looking at a screen that's just got my image and the slide. But maybe some of you are chuckling a little bit, and maybe some of you are thinking that would be impossible. I don't think there's any chance that we would fund that idea if it didn't already exist. That's certainly how I would think about that problem. And the amazing thing when I think about that problem is that as wild as an idea as the library is, as unlikely as it may be to succeed if it didn't already exist, the wild and amazing thing, of course, is that the library is something that we have, right? That incredibly radical notion that here's a way to invest in each other. Here's a kind of social infrastructure that we need. Here's a physical place that's a shared space, that's accessible, that's open, that's welcoming, that's well-designed, that dignifies people. Even here in the United States, which seems like the last place on earth that would have a thing like that, we have it, right? And we have it in kind of impressive quantity. Now, of course, we could do much more to fix it up. We haven't done much to update it. But the fact that that incredibly radical idea, that thing that seems so outrageous, is in fact something that we already live in, something that we in some ways take for granted, tells us something profound, I think. And I think what it tells us is that once upon a time, people who lived before us came up with an idea for a public good, for a social infrastructure, for a gathering place, for a democratic institution that honored our values and invested in it. And some of the people who invested in it were like Carnegie, mixed record. Carnegie's not really the story behind the library. The story behind the library is the movement of progressive people who called for investment in this kind of vehicle. That's the story of the library, and governments who ultimately decided to take it on. And if that's part of the story, the other part of the story is that something has happened that has made us very reluctant to invest in that way now. Something has happened that has shifted our priorities such that the idea, the concept of a library seems outlandish. Possibly one of the things that's happened is that we have just taken it for granted, that we are like the prodigal children of this generation, many generations ago, who are squandering our inheritance, right? Because it raises the question of what is it that we are doing to make sure that institutions and spaces like this are available for the people who come next. But possibly there's something more going on. And possibly, and I guess this is where I want to end, possibly this is our moment to do something different. Possibly as we start to square up to this task of remaking the social infrastructure, of rebuilding infrastructure, of dealing with life after the pandemic and life in a climate change world, that we will not just think about how to defend ourselves from threats, but we will also think about how to make our collective lives better so that next time around, social closeness and social solidarity wins. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to get rid of my screen and welcome Malkit back to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was a fantastic lecture. And you started it by saying, I don't want to I probably preach to the choir, but you don't. And it's always very important to be reminded that how important public values are and the relationship between the built environment and public space and public life is, especially because the built environment is so much linked and married to the world of finance that force us to produce closed spaces. I wish we would work more, and our briefs will be produced more by sociologists like you that remind us of these values all the time. So thank you for that. And you weren't speaking to a black screen. There were about 170 people following this lecture, faculty and students. And there are a few questions from I think students. Let me try to follow them and read them out loud to you. The first question from Benjamin Villa He asked, what do you think is the role of the private sector in these public spaces and social infrastructure? Do you think the private sector can intervene in public spaces through their management to maximize and increase their use? Or do you think it's dangerous for the private sector, even if through a private-public partnership, to control these shared spaces? This is
so the private sector is a part of the social infrastructure. I mean, the private sector plays a big role in social infrastructure, always has. The private sector in the United States is a part of government. Public-private partnerships are fundamental to the United States. Up to the library in many places has often has private sector partnerships, but more fundamentally, if you think about, the social infrastructure of England and you don't include the pub, you're missing something, right? If you think about the social infrastructure of Queens and don't include the bodega, or the South Side of Chicago and don't include the beauty salon, you're misunderstanding where the gathering places are. Now, you heard me talk a little bit about the limits of the private sector as social infrastructure. So, for instance, there is a price of admission. When you walk into a library and the librarian asks, how can I help you? They really want to help you. They want to know what you're looking for. When you walk into Starbucks and they say, how can I help you? They want to know, are you having the $7 Frappuccino or the $8 mocha latte? I mean, they have a very different idea about what helping you means. And that matters because, they're asking for something. Some of us have money and that's okay. We'll pay the price to go have that chair in the Starbucks. But for those who don't, the private sector is less helpful, right? And of course, the private sector can be quite exclusionary. And I did not really hit on this theme, but there are different kinds of social infrastructures. Some are bridging social infrastructures, to use Putnam's vocabulary again. There are social infrastructures that can connect people who might not otherwise get to know each other. Like, think of the different kinds of families that share a playground in your neighborhood, or the different kinds of families you find in the library. There are other social infrastructures that are really bonding social infrastructures that bring people together, people who already are likely to spend time with each other. Some are manifestly exclusive. They're exclusive by design, right? So there are few social infrastructures that work better than the country club if the goal is just to connect people, right? The country club in the private sector is a great way to bring people together and to build friendships and marriages and empires, right? I mean, they work very well, but they're probably not the kind of connections that we need to promote a healthy democracy. In fact, they might even misfire and do dangerous things. And so I guess in my book, I focus more on public sector social infrastructure, in part because it's more amenable to the democratic process. It's easier for us to do things with policy on the public sector side than it is on the private sector side. But a comprehensive look at social infrastructure and how it works has to reckon with the fact that the private sector is a part of the conversation.
Thank you. We have another question from our dean, Sarah Whiting. Having grown up going to the branch library as a family outing almost every week, I absolutely love your topic, but I'd like to hear you discuss to what extent our fantastic public library system has become ever more socially stratified. While they bring people together, as you beautifully showed, a huge segment of more privileged American middle class and upper class don't tend to partake. In short, is there a way to make this social infrastructure connected across class?
So it's a great question. I would say this. First of all, you do in fact find middle class and very affluent Americans in public libraries. The easy thing you find is you find them in suburban libraries. So if you go to affluent communities, you will find they invest a lot in their public libraries. They have beautiful public libraries, and even very affluent people use them when they are the right kind of spaces for them. Even in cities, in fact, there is a strong core of middle class and professional people who continue to use libraries. My argument here is not that they are perfectly integrated places and that they are easy places for that integration. The reverse is obviously true. And what this question pushes us to think about is how libraries have become kind of places of last resort for all of the people who slip through these massive gaps in our safety net, right? So if you suffer from a severe mental illness and you live in an American city, you will wind up in a library. If you're homeless and you live in an American city, you will wind up in a library because it's warm or cool or there are bathrooms there, right? If you have a problem with drug addiction, you'll wind up in a library. If you're old and alone, you'll wind up in a library. If you've come out of prison and you need to look for a job, you'll wind up in a library. And so I think the difficult thing for people who live in a society like ours that's organized around segregation by class, that has so many safe and comfortable places for people who can buy their way into them, is that to walk into a library is to opt into seeing reality, which is something we work very hard not to do. And so of course, many people are avoiding libraries for that reason, and they prefer to get their books on a Kindle or from a bookshop, or they prefer to sit in a Starbucks. I'll say two things about that. Despite this fact, find me places in the United States where you find more integration by class or by race or age or ethnicity than the public library. And so even in Cambridge, even in the Lower East Side, even in Palo Alto, where I spent time, at Stanford, you walk into the library, and the library is a relatively integrated and connected place compared to others. People who walk into them see something about their society. And I guess in my vision of the world, it's not that these social infrastructures have to be places that turn everyone into bosom buddies, close friends. They're places that have to teach us how to get along with each other and to recognize kind of who we are. And I think libraries still serve that function. So I guess if I were king, I would build a better safety net so that libraries could do the kinds of things that they kind of fundamentally want to do, which is not just, books, but also the cultural programming and the shared spaces. And so libraries would not be responsible for daycare for children whose parents are both at work. I saw kids as young as 4 or 5 years old dropped off at the library at opening hours and not picked up for 8 or 10 hours during the day. They would not be places where unhoused people, spend their winters looking for a good bathroom. They would not be places that are, warehouses for people who are mentally ill, because we'd have other facilities that do that. And when we get together in policy circles to think about how to fund the library, we should think like we better give them resources because they are de facto providing those things, but also we better shore up those other elements of the safety net. So if I were king, I would make it so that libraries and librarians didn't face all that pressure. That said, even with the problems they face, there is something extraordinary about walking into a library in any place, including an unequal one.
Okay, thank you, Eric.
That's a long answer. Sorry, that's about it's a great question. It's an important question. If I were the dean of a design school, I would love to get some people working on that.
Okay, so I have there are many more questions. I will pick 2 specific questions. One is by Ariel Rawlings, and it's the question goes: are effective social infrastructure necessarily built on publicly owned lands? Are there civic ways that communities can fight against the privatization of publicly owned spaces and facilities, such as the USPS? This is one question. And the second question is, how can we adapt the digital world we inhabit now to incorporate the best of the library idea? Zoom isn't that personal connection. So what do we do? And probably this is one of the things that you cover in the next book, no?
It is something I think about a lot. I will say on this question, I have a friend named Eli Pariser, who wrote a book years ago called The Filter Bubble, about kind of the way in which the internet segments us. He's one of the people who started Move On, creative guy. And what he is trying to do right now, he has this big project, and I'm spacing the name, unfortunately, but Eli, maybe if someone knows this project or is on Google, you can share it in the chat with everyone. But this project is basically trying to figure out how can you make the internet a better social infrastructure. In the book, I make the argument that the internet is a communications infrastructure, and it clearly serves all these important functions for our communications, but not really a social infrastructure in the way that I define it, not a physical place that brings us together. And I recognize this is a controversial claim because we spend all of this time connecting with each other online. It clearly, social things happen on it, and it clearly is an infrastructure that facilitates some kind of social life. I, have privileged the face-to-face and the interpersonal, and I do this knowing that online social life can be wonderful and redemptive. It can save us. I think about people who have rare illnesses, who can't find other people in their situation without the internet, and who form groups that are meaningful there. I think about teenagers who grow up in small towns where there's hostility towards different kinds of sexuality, and find companionship and support online. But despite that, I think if I said right now, I've just gotten a message from on high that this, the pandemic shutdown, the social distancing is going to last another 20 years, and so GSD will be doing all of its public events here on Zoom for the next 20 years. We would feel that as a deep loss. That would be a horrible blow. I mean, we'd all be deeply depressed. We can't wait to be back together in person, because if, as terrific as it is to see, 180 people here tonight, and all these names on the screen, there's no kind of joy that I see you getting when I make a funny joke about $12 ice cream cones. And there's no dinner afterwards where we can talk about what the GSD could do to design a great studio about libraries and inequality. And there's no graduate student who really wants to work on this, who can come and talk to me afterwards and set up an internship in New York City. And there's no drinks of the graduate students afterwards on their own to go talk about all the ridiculous things I said and how problematic the whole lecture was. And so we miss something, right, in this context of online life. It thins out something. And I don't know that we're going to get it in the metaverse when we put on our Oculus goggles and we do this in virtual reality. I mean, maybe it's going to be better. But it seems to me like it's okay to be an essentialist who privileges face-to-face social life sometimes. That said, go check out Eli Paris's work, because maybe he's figured this out. On how to defend public spaces against privatization, I mean, it's kind of one of the battles of our time. I can't say that I have the answers, from an activist perspective about how you do it. But it does seem to me like the values that we have to key into are values like belonging and accessibility for everyone, things like equity. The private sector does not have the best record on those matters. And it seems to me like those are public values that we have to promote, within a democratic space. And so I can't say that I know how to win that fight. But I think that it's my hope that the book gives you a set of concepts that could be used to have that fight.
Okay, I'll go to the next question by Naomi Robelino. What role do you think the role of municipal planning departments should play in identifying, creating, and programming social infrastructure? So
I think municipal planning departments should be all over this. I think the idea of social infrastructure is my gift to the planning departments of the world who don't want to deal with it. I mean, that in my fantasy life, it is a concept that's picked up there, because it does. I mean, it's my conviction that if you work in a planning department, that if you work in city government, that if you work in an engineering firm, that you work in an architecture firm, that the concept of social infrastructure creates different possibilities for how you design and for how you invest, right? I mean, take the most basic thing. We're going to invest in flood control, right? We need to deal with the fact that there's all this water, that sea levels are rising. one simple thing you can do to keep the water from, getting from the river into your city is to build a levee. A levee can just be a mound of dirt, and it does its job of keeping the water, this big heavy piece of earth with maybe some reinforced, concrete and steel. It will, keep the water out as long as the levee works. But it's just a wall, right? We build a wall, and building a wall is not always the best solution for things. Sometimes it causes problems. If you have the concept of social infrastructure as a municipal planner, the levee can be designed differently. You could flatten the top of the levee. You can expand it out. You could build a bridging berm. Remember that concept, Malkit? The bridging berm. You could turn the levee into a park. You could turn the park into a sponge, right? The park could have a biking path and a walking path. It could have green space. It could have fields. It could have a playground. It's functioning like a levee, but you've designed your water infrastructure. You've designed your climate infrastructure to also be social infrastructure, right? And it seems to me like if we start to see the world through the lens of social infrastructure, the way we build could be very different, and it expands our possibilities. Sometimes that means that each individual project is slightly more expensive than it might otherwise be, but not nearly as expensive as it would be to ignore it altogether and let the problems fester, or not nearly as it would be to, just build a playground without thinking about how it could connect to the water. And so it seems to me like as we get primed for all of the projects that we'll need in the next 10, 20 years, social infrastructure is an essential tool.
Thank you. We have a question from Anna Teresa Renner. To what extent do you think that social infrastructure, such as public libraries, are covering up failures of the social security system, which one might argue is the responsibility of the state? For example, making homeless people less visible while the actual problem of homelessness is not tackled.
Well, I think that is the argument I was making. I think, one of the dangers of having a terrific and robust library system is that it absorbs all these problems that in an ideal world would be tackled by other institutions. And I think, the problem that Sarah identified, which is that you could walk into a library with the best of intentions and the greatest of hopes, and you bring your child in and you find that the first several tables are, occupied by people who don't have homes and haven't been able to shower, or people who have severe mental illnesses or drug addiction, and suddenly you get worried about your security and the security of your child, and you don't want to send your child there. Those are problems born of a system in which, we allow kind of basic public services to fall apart when the safety net does not work, and turn the library into a kind of vehicle of last resort, a place of last resort. And that is unfair for libraries to do that. It's not that the library covers up those problems in some ways, but probably the library keeps people alive. And if only I thought that, if we didn't have libraries keeping people alive, people would suffer and die, and Americans would rise up and say, we won't tolerate that. That's wrong. But I think if anything, in these last couple of years, we've learned that Americans have an incredible ability to tolerate suffering and death of others. Especially poor people, especially Black people. It's shocking the extent to which Americans are willing to accept that, feel unmoved by that. So I don't know that kind of flushing it all out into the street would do anything different. I know that libraries are keeping people alive. I wish that libraries didn't have to do that. I wish that we could think about libraries in the context of these other kinds of places.
Thank you. I think we have time for one final question coming from Argentina, from Magdalena Ayera. Thank you, Eric, for the great presentation. I have been working in place-based cultural and urban redevelopment projects with a focus on creative industry as a diver within the public sector. As a policymaker, one of our big challenges to create robust projects is extremely ideological, polarized context that cuts across all the sectors, especially within the cultural arena. I would like to listen to your thoughts regarding polarization and public spaces.
Well, so this is the theme of the book. You'll note that there's one of the subtitles is, kind of how you build social infrastructure to deal with polarization. And, it is not an easy problem. Let's be clear about that. I don't think you just build libraries and you solve the problem of polarization, not by a long shot. I will say that there are public spaces that can allow people to get beyond some of the first order differences and to get beyond the kind of deeply acrimonious and sometimes violent interactions that characterize our life together online. There's nothing like a fight on Twitter to expose the depth of our humanity. I spend a lot of time in my life on soccer fields. Argentina has some soccer fields. I used to spend a lot of time with my children in Argentine soccer fields. We lived in Argentina for a while. And one of the things that was always very interesting for me about going onto soccer fields is that I would be there because, I had a child who loved to play soccer. Other families were there because their children loved to play soccer. And we would find ourselves standing around these fields for hours at a time while our kids were enjoying themselves. And the edges of soccer fields are places where I wind up encountering people who have wildly different views from me on a whole range of things. And I tend not to start those conversations with them by talking about, Trump or Bernie, or Joe Biden. We tend to find some other areas of common ground. Maybe it's our children whom we love. Maybe it's, whether Messi is better than Ronaldo. In Argentina, there's a clear answer for that. But we find some other area and build relationships that way. And I guess when I think about shared spaces that can work for polarization, a playground, a library, a schoolyard, a park, a bowling league, soccer field, a pub even, the challenge is to find some place where we can recognize our shared humanity and find some way of establishing a connection that just reminds us that we share humanity, that we are people. And that is a pretty, I will admit that is a pretty low bar for for decency. This is not the most ambitious fantasy. This is not kind of socialist utopia I'm describing here. It's like, how do we get people who are different to recognize shared humanity? But if you're in the world with me right now, you probably agree with me that might be as good of an expectation, as good of a goal as we could get at the moment. Like, if we could achieve that, that would really be an achievement at this point. And so, I guess I take heart from the fact that libraries are tremendously popular in conservative areas and in liberal areas. There are some conservative areas that have fought against funding for their libraries, but for the most part, that's not an issue. People like the way that they serve them. There are, tremendous and oftentimes surprising levels of support for these gathering places. And when they're gone, people really miss them. And we're even under certain circumstances, especially when we don't start with a conversation about, whether we should get vaccinated or whether we should support one political candidate or another. We are able to establish something that we share. And again, my claim here is not that solves our problems. It's just that that's the best possible place for us to start.
Thank you. I think we are more or less done with the event.
Where's the dinner party?
Oh, well, next time.
Where are we all meeting for dinner, Malkit?
Yes. But thank you so much. It was great. And it's such an indispensable lens for us to use as architects and designers and planners when we look at briefs and space and at our design. So I think it was really great and inspiring. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I think designers and sociologists should talk more often.
I agree.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's such an honor to do this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Malkit.